Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Race in the Crucible of War, African American Servicemen and the War in Vietnam, by Gerald F. Goodwin, narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Author's Note: Please note that racial slurs are used within this book when directly quoting interviewees or other source material. While it is now unusual to see this sort of offensive language in formal writing, when it is generally considered inappropriate, and its presence may understandably be upsetting to some readers, I believe it is important to retain this language in the quotations here to accurately reflect what people said, especially given the subject matter of the book. Introduction. On March 3, 1970, Black Journal, a public affairs show on national education television, broadcast an hour-long examination of the experiences of African Americans in the Vietnam War. Filmed on location in various regions of Vietnam, as well as Okinawa, Japan, the episode featured interviews with a cross-section of black servicemen, low-ranking draftees, enlisted men, officers, Brigadier General Frederick E. Davison, the first black combat general in the history of the U.S. Army, as well as L. Howard Bennett, a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. William Greaves, host, producer, and director of Black Journal, argued this focus was necessary because of the distorted picture usually seen in the press and on our home television screens. He argued that the media often provided an overly optimistic as well as simplistic account of the black experience in Vietnam, cautioning, "When we look at television and newspapers, we are led to believe that only an occasional black man serves in the military and then in perfect harmony with the white GI. The reality was much different. Black participation in the military was not new, but Vietnam was the first major conflict in which the armed forces were fully racially integrated. Executive Order 9981 officially desegregated the armed forces in 1948, but many units remained segregated until late 1954. African American participation in Vietnam was also not new when the crew of Black Journal arrived in late 1969 or early 1970. When the first two American Marine battalions waded ashore at Red Beach 2 in Da Nang on March 8, 1965, African Americans, including Raymond Leon Horn, were among them. A corporal from Chicago, Horn had been drafted the previous year and stationed in Quang Nam Province. His time in Vietnam was short as he was killed by an explosive device on May 1st, making him the first African American to die in Vietnam. He would not be the last. As the military commitment increased, so too did the number of African Americans involved. Their contributions were considerable. Of the roughly 2.5 million Americans who served, 300,000 were African American, approximately 12%. African Americans represented 12.6% of the 58,022 Americans who died in the war. Both percentages were slightly higher than their percentage of the civilian population, which was between 10.5 and 11.1% at the time. When correspondent Kent Garrett and Black Journal traveled to Vietnam and Okinawa, they were concerned with more than the contributions and sacrifices of African Americans. Garrett's interview sought to investigate and bring attention to race relations and discrimination in the military. The focus was understandable given that the start of the Vietnam War coincided with successes in the civil rights movement, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, racial tension, continued discrimination, and even violence also characterized domestic race relations between 1965 and 1970. Post-1965, Southern whites continued to resist integration. Rioting in Chicago, Detroit, Newark, and dozens of other American cities in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in April 1968 made it difficult to argue that racial equality had been achieved or racial relations were improving. Black Journal knew well the realities of race relations. The show was created as a response to the Kerner Commission's conclusion that the lack of black perspectives in the media had contributed to the 1967 Detroit and Newark riots. Fully funded by the federal government and premiering in June 1968, Black Journal was created to help prevent future rioting. Ironically, the first show was broadcast only a few months after the rioting in dozens of American cities following King's assassination. King's assassination also impacted race relations in the American military in Vietnam. By the time of Black Journal's report in 1970, race tensions, discrimination, and violence were widespread. African Americans were clearly not living in perfect harmony with the white GI. Black Journal understood that relations were poor, discrimination was common, and similarities existed between the Black experience with racism in the United States and in Vietnam. Historically, many African Americans viewed military service as an escape from the racism inherent in American civilian life, but Black Journal found little difference between levels of discrimination in the United States and in the military. Greaves noted, Blacks in the service recognize familiar patterns of discrimination common to civilian life. Garrett similarly observed, carrying a rifle in the infantry is just like pushing a broom in civilian life. The Black man doesn't escape it in the infantry for the same reasons he doesn't escape it on the outside: inferior education and opportunities in a racist society. This experience led Black servicemen to question whether the real war is in Vietnam or America, in Saigon or Harlem. As Black Journal's reporting suggests, Black experiences with race and issues related to race in Vietnam were inextricably linked to their experiences with these same issues back home. Race in the Crucible of War argues that African Americans experienced and interpreted racial issues, race relations, prejudice, and discrimination in Vietnam through a lens heavily influenced by their personal experiences with these same issues in the United States, as well as the larger historical experiences of African Americans. Current and historical American racism and race relations loomed large in Vietnam. Fighting a war in a faraway country did not allow African Americans to escape the long-standing racial environment they grew up in, nor did it enable them to forget their personal encounters with racism back home. These experiences continued to influence them. War is often viewed as a crucible, but American racism, race relations, and racial perspectives proved remarkably resilient and durable despite the potentially corrosive effects of war. As the first conflict in which Blacks and whites served in desegregated units from the beginning, race relations were a significant aspect of the Black experience. It was difficult to predict what relations would be given the armed forces' limited experiences dealing with race relations, especially during wartime. This new environment provided an opportunity for a changed experience for African Americans serving their country in war. This integrated environment provides us with an opportunity to ask new questions. Would Black and white servicemen view and treat one another as equals? Would Black servicemen encounter the same levels of racial prejudice and discrimination as faced by African Americans back home? Would Black experiences change over the course of the war? How would events back home influence relations between Black and white servicemen? Would racial tensions rise and fall? As we will see, there was little stability or consistency regarding race relations in Vietnam. Race relations could be typified by friendship and cooperation in one time period, war zone or unit, while discrimination, tension, and even violence were the norm in the next. Sometimes these realities overlapped. Even when African Americans appeared to be living in perfect harmony with the white GI, this was only part of the story. Vietnam provided no escape from the racism and discrimination commonplace back home. African Americans routinely and justifiably complained of racial discrimination, including allegations that they were disproportionately assigned menial duties, not promoted to the ranks they deserved, and unfairly targeted for punishment. The impact of racial discrimination in Vietnam was eerily familiar. Greaves noted that Blacks above the grade of junior officer are just as rare as Black civilians with positions of power. A black soldier interviewed by Black Journal argued that military service was a dead end for African Americans looking for meaningful career advancement. He noted, "I was in Vietnam for 26 months. I was still a fucking private after 26 months, and I am still a fucking private now." African Americans found themselves targeted in other ways as well, especially in the first few years of the conflict. Garrett commented, "The black man in the Army is more likely than his white counterpart to be sent to Vietnam in the first place. Once there, more likely to wind up in the frontline combat units, and thus, within the combat unit, is more likely than the white to be killed or wounded." There was considerable merit to his analysis. Black servicemen could not escape the knowledge of escalating tensions back home. In the first years of increased military intervention, racial violence was generally confined to the southern states, where white racists attacked black demonstrators and their supporters. However, race-related riots in Watts, in Los Angeles in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 1967, and particularly in numerous American cities after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968, revealed racial disharmony on the home front. To paraphrase Malcolm X, the chickens came home to roost in Vietnam. American racial discord traveled readily to Vietnam, and incidents of racial tension and violence were commonplace in the years following King's assassination. Relations deteriorated to such an extent that Time journalist Wallace Terry reported in September 1969 that there was another war being fought in Vietnam, between black and white Americans. Black Journal arrived in Vietnam 5 months later, and nearly every African American they interviewed acknowledged that incidents of racial violence were widespread and routine. These men directly linked increased tensions and incidents of violence to the unwillingness of black servicemen to accept racial discrimination. Asked for his perspective, a black naval patrolman named Hayes responded, "The common black man, he has been pushed, and pushed all his life. He reached the point now where he wants to push back, you know. I am not going to go out there and be no Tom or anything to nobody, and I feel like you pushed me too far. I am going to definitely strike back at you." The other war in Vietnam damaged the cohesion and morale of the American fighting forces, as well as distracted them from their stated purpose, the defense of the Republic of Vietnam, RVN, and its citizens from the forces of the National Liberation Front, NLF, and the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, which sought to overthrow the government. The American military effort undoubtedly suffered as a result. Race relations were complicated by the presence of the Vietnamese. African Americans encountered many different groups in Vietnam: civilians, soldiers defending the RVN, and supporters or even members of the NLF or PAVN. These interactions were an important element of African Americans' experiences during the war. Black interactions with and impressions of the civilian population were complex. Their perceptions reflected and raised questions about race, identity, discrimination, and the solidarity of non-white groups. How did African Americans view the civilians they were tasked with protecting? How did African Americans believe the Vietnamese viewed them? How did the racial views African Americans brought with them impact these perceptions? How did racial developments in the United States influence their views? American servicemen's perceptions of civilians were influenced by the difficulty they had in identifying Vietnamese affiliations or loyalties. African-American poet and Vietnam veteran Lamont Steptoe identified this problem in his poem, Uncle's South Sea China Blue Nightmare. Steptoe writes, "In country, Vietnamese shine boots, wash laundry, make love to you. Some even try to end your life with a bang." As his poem suggests, the average American serviceman, black or white, had varied and contrasting images of Vietnamese civilians. They could be a servant, a sexual partner, a co-combatant, or a killer. Even black servicemen whose interactions with civilians were limited often developed strong impressions of the local population. Knowing very little about Vietnam or its people, African Americans interpreted what they observed from a perspective shaped almost entirely by their own experiences back home. They saw a parallel between the poverty and discrimination experienced by African Americans and the poverty and mistreatment experienced by Vietnamese civilians. African American soldier Thomas Brannan quickly recognized that Vietnamese people were struggling like hell, which he could understand as being mistreated was part of our history. He further elaborated, "A lot of us who are black Americans, if not having lived it ourselves, can tell you about the times in our collective history where our families have struggled with the boot on the neck." African Americans believed that Vietnamese civilians empathized in turn with them as victims of racial discrimination. This perception suggested that the Vietnamese were not only aware of American racism and racial politics more generally, but that this knowledge led them to empathize with African Americans. Yet black Vietnamese relations were complicated by the behavior and actions of racist whites who brought racist views to Vietnam and broadcast them. Black Journal interviewed Bobby Jenkins, a black sailor who described meeting a 7- or 8-year-old Vietnamese shoeshine girl who told him, "The black man is ugly. He a monkey, got a tail." Certain of where the young girl had gotten these opinions, Jenkins recalled, "She never knew what black was before the white man come on. He bring us way over here to teach people something like that." Jenkins concluded that Vietnam was just like the world in Georgia, Alabama, wherever you are, even in the North. Civilians were not the only Vietnamese African Americans encountered. Like all servicemen, African Americans were tasked with fighting NLF and PAVN forces. What did African Americans think about these groups? What did African Americans think communist forces thought about them and their participation in the war? What role did race play in forming these perceptions? How did developments back home sway these impressions? While the circumstances of these two interactions were quite different, African Americans nonetheless developed strong opinions of Vietnamese communist forces. Their views were not entirely dissimilar to their impressions of the civilian population. This sympathetic depiction might seem surprising. However, black views were influenced by communist propaganda circulated in leaflets and radio broadcasts that expressed sympathy for African Americans and support for the civil rights movement. This propaganda also linked the black experience in Vietnam to the black experience with discrimination in the United States. African Americans were not the only ones for whom the American racial situation loomed large. Despite the significance of the black experience in the Vietnam War and the central role played by race and racism on that experience, there is relatively little written about the topic. The limited historiography includes 2 books by historian James E. Westheider, Fighting on Two Fronts, African Americans and the Vietnam War, 1997, and The African American Experience in Vietnam, Brothers in Arms, 2007. Herman Graham III's The Brothers Vietnam War, Black Power, Manhood, and the Military Experience, 2003, is another useful source. While these books expand our understanding, they are fairly limited in their scope. Westheider focuses on how the war and experiences of black servicemen changed African Americans' image of military service as a means of advancement. Graham's book is a gendered analysis of how the armed services used images of masculinity to attract African Americans to military service. Other works touch on issues related to the black experience. Lawrence Allen Eldridge's Chronicles of a Two-Front War is first and foremost an examination of ways in which the black press covered the war. Jeremy Maxwell's Brotherhood in Combat, How African Americans Found Equality in Korea and Vietnam, tries to compare the black experience during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Kyle Longley's Grunts, The American Combat Soldier in Vietnam, provides a limited discussion of black-white relations and black complaints of discrimination. Christian J. Appy's Working Class War briefly considers black servicemen and racial issues in general. Richard Moser's The New Winter Soldiers and David Courtwright's Soldiers in Revolt discuss the experiences of African Americans who opposed the war while also investigating incidents of social unrest and complaints of racial discrimination. Isaac Hampton II's The Black Officer Corps examines the experiences of black officers in Vietnam. George Lepray's Fragging, Why U.S. Soldiers Assaulted Their Officers in Vietnam is a useful discussion of attacks on officers by enlisted men. Lepray analyzes incidents that appear to be connected to racial issues. Kimberly L. Phillips's War, What Is It Good For? Provides an interesting window into the rise of black protest within the military during the period. Gary D. Solis's Marines and Military Law in Vietnam and William Thomas Allison's Military Justice in Vietnam provide limited discussions of incidents of racial violence. Collectively, these sources describe aspects of the black experience in Vietnam. However, they do not analyze fully how that experience was influenced by race and racism. They also do not examine sufficiently the relationship between domestic racial developments and racial relations in the military. Some of these works recognize the existence of racial tensions and violence during the conflict, but they understate the prevalence and significance of such issues. They also underplay the level of discrimination African Americans faced. They provide no significant discussion of African Americans' perceptions of and interactions with Vietnamese civilians and combatants. One must be cautious generalizing about the black experience given the large number of African Americans who served and the diversity of experiences they could and did have. The use of limited sources could result in a biased or inaccurate account. To reduce the possibility of bias or inaccuracy, I have used a wide variety of sources, many of them previously unexamined by historians. African American Vietnam veterans have published numerous memoirs. There are also published collections of oral histories that include the testimonies of African Americans. The most valuable is African American journalist Wallace Terry's Bloods, An Oral History of the Vietnam War by Black Veterans, 1984. A journalist for Time magazine, Terry spent years interviewing servicemen in Vietnam, and Bloods includes 20 interviews with black veterans about their wartime experiences. Eddie writes Thoughts about the Vietnam War based on my personal experiences, books I have read, and conversations with other veterans, which includes interviews with 6 black veterans, as well as the author's own remembrances as a black veteran, provides some useful insights. I have also used less traditional sources such as documentaries and poetry. Same Mud, Same Blood, 1967. No Vietnamese Ever Called Me Nigger, 1968. The Black GI, 1970, and Bloods of Nam, 1986, are documentaries that provide valuable information concerning the experiences of black servicemen in Vietnam. I have likewise employed poems written by veterans including Lamont Steptoe's Mad Minute, 1993, Dusty Road, 1995, and Uncle's South China Sea Blue Nightmare, 1995, and Horace Coleman's In the Grass, 1995. I have utilized articles published in contemporary newspapers and magazines, including the Baltimore Sun, Boston Globe, Chicago Daily Defender, Chicago Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, Cleveland Call and Post, Ebony, Hartford Courant, Jet, Los Angeles Sentinel, Los Angeles Times, Newsday, New York Amsterdam News, New York Times, Norfolk, VA, Journal and Guide, Philadelphia Tribune, Pittsburgh Courier, Globe and Mail, Toronto, and the Washington Post. These articles, which number in the hundreds, provide valuable information about a host of issues relevant to the black experience. Many of these articles directly quote African Americans serving in Vietnam, which provides a vivid and immediate expression of how individuals felt about numerous issues of importance. articles written by African-American journalists like Wallace Terry, Ethel L. Payne of the Chicago Daily Defender, Thomas A. Johnson of the New York Times, and Donald Mosby of the Chicago Daily Defender are especially valuable as these journalists spent significant time interviewing black servicemen about their experiences. In addition to information found in memoirs, films, and contemporary news sources, I have conducted extensive archival research. I have used materials found at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, USAHEC, at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, and particularly the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, DCSPER, Policy Files on Discrimination in the Army collection. Included in this collection are official military reports of racial tension and violence on American military bases in the United States, Europe, Asia, and of course Vietnam. Of particular interest are hundreds of military criminal incident reports, which contain information on racially motivated crimes, including assault and murder. I have also relied heavily on research conducted at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, NACP. The U.S. Forces in Southeast Asia, 1950-75, collection, USF-SEA, includes hundreds of reports about incidents of racial violence. These reports, most of which concern incidents occurring between 1969 and 1971, depict racial friction and even violence as commonplace in the cities of Vietnam and on military bases. Collectively, these materials provide a more complete picture of race relations in the military during the Vietnam War. These sources reveal that incidents of tension and even violence were far more common and pronounced than previously thought. They provide convincing evidence that African American complaints of discrimination were widespread throughout the conflict. Lastly, they reveal that the armed forces were aware of tensions in the military and of black complaints of racial discrimination. To augment the information garnered from memoirs, news sources, archives, and other media, I have interviewed dozens of black veterans who served at various times and in different zones of the war. I have also interviewed white veterans, lawyers, and a black Army psychiatrist. These interviews have provided me with the opportunity to compare and even verify information found in other sources, as well as to ask more detailed questions about issues addressed and not addressed in other sources. These interviews were particularly helpful in gaining additional knowledge about the complexities of race relations in Vietnam, especially regarding African American interactions with and perceptions of the Vietnamese, a topic all but ignored by previous historical works. I am the only historian to have conducted detailed interviews with such a large cross-section of African American Vietnam veterans. My book will, I hope, properly place black voices in the forefront of the discussion. Collectively, these sources provide great insight into the experiences of African American service members in the Vietnam War. Race relations, prejudice, and discrimination was central, as was the strong link between race and racism in the United States and the wartime experience of African Americans. African Americans understandably interpreted what they experienced in Vietnam from the vantage point of their own racial histories and personal experiences. They had left the United States, at least for a year or more, but they could not leave its racial heritage behind. Chapter 1. We Was Just Us. Deracialization on the Front Lines of the Vietnam War. In 1967, NBC journalist Frank McGee spent nearly a month living with soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division as they fought Viet Cong forces for control of the region west of Phu Lai. On the surface, McGee's assignment, which resulted in the NBC documentary, Same Mud, Same Blood, was not unique. Hundreds of journalists were in Vietnam, and McGee was hardly the first to try to cover the conflict from the perspective of servicemen. However, McGee's approach was distinct because he was not particularly interested in portraying combat, war strategy, or really the war effort at all. Same Mud, Same Blood shows little actual fighting. Instead, McGee focused his attention on race relations among the 40 black and white soldiers who served under Platoon Sergeant Lewis B. Larry, an African-American from Mississippi. McGee's interest in the black experience in Vietnam and his focus on race relations reflected several...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?